The Twilight Wanderer is one of the three most important releases in Force of Will's history, all three being highly damaging to the game as a whole. Millennia of ages because retailers were not told the nature of the set and consequently over-ordered. Faria the Sacred Queen versus Melgus the Flame King because it brought Leviathan the Demon Sword, Lancelot the Knight of Mad Demon, Guinevere the Jealous Queen, and Rook Egg into the game. A broken regalia and a power-crept resonator package. Finally, the Twilight Wanderer, because while most of the rulers had power crept, one warped the game around it, making Force of Will a much less enjoyable game as a whole. But as I said last time, that topic is a bit more nuanced than people give it credit for. Most of the rulers were pretty bad prior to this set, but that's a topic for another day. Let's dig in. We start with Alice, Girl of the Lake. She doesn't do anything. No, quite literally. She doesn't do anything. We have now changed terminology from J-Activate to Judgment. That's worth mentioning. Judgment cost of 8, that is reduced by 1 for each fairy you control. Fairies was a 5-colour weenie deck that actually did turn up in top 8 lists. Just not with Alice. Much like how Prisha and Rezard had their themes used by other rulers, but never showed up themselves. That said, Alice gets this down to around 3 or 4 will fairly easily. When Alice casts Judgment, she becomes a 900/900 flying Fairy Queen J-Ruler. Force of Will has some odd rulings regarding resonator types, caused by both Fairy and Fairy Tale being types. The type is read as a string of text. It's not searched for keywords. So where a creature, vampire, soldier in Magic is seen as a creature, a vampire, and a soldier, in Force of Will it would only be seen as a resonator and a vampire soldier. Alice gets around this by having a slash in her typing. She's both a fairy and a queen. Unfortunately, no card that really matters in the fairy support can target Alice. They are all resonator support. When she enters, she recovers all of your fairies. Fairies all have flying, and there are some buffs in the archetype. It can be game-winning. More so with her God's Art, Remnants of Utopia. For 2 light will, your resonators gain +200/+200, which is permanent, not for the turn. Then you can tutor a copy of Excalibur, the Spirit God's Sword, from your deck to the field. Unfortunately, that's not much of a boon. Excalibur is a 2-cost regalia that gives your J-Ruler +100/+100 for each resonator you control. Can tap for any attribute, but that will can only be used to pay for fairies, and finally, can be banished to give your J-Ruler imperishable. The ramp is fine. It's specific and can be gotten rid of. The plus power isn't that great unless you're using Leviathan the Demon Sword to give Alice swiftness, and it's reliant not only on your ability to field the board, but deal with threats and keep up your pace. Alice is a lot like Prisha. Her theme deck is actually good, just not her. She doesn't really add all that much to it. She doesn't do much of anything. Even on J-Ruler, she feels like a whole lot of nothing. I do think she's better than Prisha, but that's an extremely low bar. Sylvia has a rather strange errata. Her original typing was Clan Founder. This is wrong. She is a minion of the Primogenitor, the same as Blazer. I'm not sure how you make that mistake. They couldn't be further from each other, but I guess it was a retcon or some type of beta material that made it to printing due to poor proofreading. Sylvia has a judgment cost of fire, wind, and 2 void, but it's worth it. She has 1 ability, it's much like Blazer, but I'd argue it's a little bit better. Your fire magic stones can produce wind. Now you still have to run magic stones of blasting waves, since the J-Ruler doesn't have this ability, but it allows you to play the early game aggressively and plays perfectly with one of the most prominent cards of the Alice cluster, Lancelot, Knight of Mad Demon. Lancelot is a 600/600 with swiftness for 2 fire will that can deal 700 damage to target resonator if it has 1000 or more attack when it attacks. It also has to attack should you choose to attack. This came with Rook Egg, a 1-drop that couldn't attack but tutored a fire resonator to your hand from your deck when it died, and Guinevere, a card that could sack you a resonator to filter your hand or boost a resonator by 400/400 at the cost of that resonator dying at the end of turn. The deck also has Cthulhu from Millennia of Ages, a 500/500 with swiftness that could have its cost paid by sacking a fire resonator rather than paying its will cost. It would grow even stronger with the Moonlit Saviour and Battle for Ataractia. Wind opened the deck up to the native use of Rapid Growth, a 400/400 pump spell with Remnant for Wind. Multiple uses of Lancelot at full power whenever you want without a hand cost. When Sylvia flips, she becomes a 1000/1000 dragon, minion of the Primogenitor with flying. When she enters, she deals 1000 damage to target J Resonator, and when she kills a J Resonator, you can recover up to 3 magic stones. Not sure why she isn't Windfire, since this is a very Windfire effect. Synergizes very nicely with the Beast Queen's counterattack, as does Lancelot for that matter. Plays very nicely with Excalibur to give her precision. For her era, 1000 damage takes out most J-Rulers, and Leviathan can pump it up further if necessary. 1000/1000 fire with swiftness can't be understated. Sylvia was a very popular card, and rightfully so. She had an amazing deck under her, synergized well with it, very powerful by herself, and goes from a beautiful woman to a fearsome dragon. What's not to love? I was even surprised myself doing research for this video, but Sylvia only ever had one placing in a top 8, a Grand Prix in Manila, the capital of the Philippines. Originally, I didn't even notice she had that, and thought that, like Alice, she had no top 8 placements. The remaining 3 rulers of this set were tournament mainstays throughout the time the Alice cluster was current. I think it's easy to see why. Due to how consistent Magic Stone decks are, along with the prominence of Regalia in decks and the existence of 5 attribute stones in Alice cluster, colour fixing, while good, isn't that good. This is exactly why Precia went nowhere fast. As for the J-Ruler, a flying dragon, Bahamut came back into prominence in the Reflect era, while J-Ruler kill was usually covered by Black Moonbeam or a Sided Blazer. Sylvia covered a lot of bases, but someone covered each of her bases better than her. She essentially becomes Jack of all trades, master of none. That said, she is vastly superior to Alice and the overwhelming majority of the 7 kings of the land. She does something, and that deck under her is exceptionally powerful. Sylvia doesn't end up terribly low in a cluster-wide scope, but in this set specifically, she's pretty far down there. I don't think this is very well remembered. Valentina, plotting Lord of the Seas, is one of the more unique rulers up to this point, and arguably inspired a lot of the game's mechanics right up until Saga Cluster. Further than that, I suspect that it might have had some influence on other games, namely Magic the Gathering. On ruler side, Valentina can cast Judgment for water and 2 void, fair cost. She can also pay water and 1 void to search your deck for a Regalia and put it into your hand. Most every deck in Alice Cluster ran a package of Regalia for utility, so the ability to search them out is naturally good, more so than Machina's search, since most regalia are free to play. It has more benefits than normal, mostly due to the J-Ruler side of Valentina. Overlord of the Seven Seas, Valentina is a 700/700 Overlord, except she's not. When she enters the field, you reveal any number of 7 King J-Rulers from outside the game. She gains their names, God's Arts, and 100/100 for each one. With the full suite, she becomes a 1400/1400 with 7 God's Arts and access to their support. By outside of the game, she means the side deck. This very likely inspired the heavy extra deck theme Force of Will would utilise going forward. Lilius Petal uses the side deck in a similar manner, though it's more of a Yu-Gi-Oh-esque special summoning rather than this. After that you would see Shahrazad's Grimoire, the Divinity mechanic, and the Stranger deck, all seemingly inspired by this one card. Likewise, Magic rather suspiciously not only started tapping into the side deck as an extra deck after Force of Will did it, but Wizards of the Coast have said they are open to exploring the side deck as an extra deck some more. Interesting to speculate, but I digress. The reason that the regalia have more benefits is because many of them reduce the costs of God's Art when used in conjunction with their rulers. Excalibur does it by 2 if your J-Ruler is Faria. Both the Death Scythe and Leviathan do it for Rezard and Meldrus respectively. It's very possible you will get costs down to just attribute costs, and these God's Arts are designed to be devastating. They are game-winning moves, but what's more interesting is the decks that are built around Valentina. In some ways, she's a bit like the more infamous ruler of the set, making other rulers' decks better. She was prominently seen with Prisha's 4 Sacred Beasts, and later on into the cluster, the Stealth package. One build from the Philippines merged both. Builds using machines were quite rare, leaving Machina as just a +100/+100 boost. The rather interesting thing is, the God's Arts names and buffs are just given to Valentina permanently. If she dies for whatever reason, she still has them. The main reason why Valentina was so in tune with the 4 Sacred Beasts is because of the regalia interaction. She can reduce the X cost up to the full 4 void necessary to get out all 4 Sacred Beasts, and she can do it around turn 4. This gives you an 800 life gain, a draw, a bounce of a Resonator up to a 4 cost, and deal 800 damage to something. Then you have Faria for game winning later on, Meldrus and Valentina for control, Ala and Rezard for board nuking. While a bit of a gimmicky deck, it does work. This is on top of Valentina herself, who gains a slew of keywords from her regalia, on top of her 1400/1400 body. Valentina was fairly prominent at the time. Not as big as Reflect, of course, but she had solid appearances throughout the Grim Alice New Frontiers and Alice Cluster formats. While a very influential card in terms of game design, I think she has a lot going for her in terms of play value. The whole gimmick of gaining the regalia and God's Arts of the fallen and dethroned 7 kings is both flavoursome and a fun, explosive play. She's also competitive, raising up a deck that would have otherwise remained casual only. While Valentina's legacy is up for debate, namely her influence, the card itself is one of the better designs of the cluster. No point in beating around the bush, this card is infamous. Reflect, Child of Potential / Refrain, Child of Convergence, is by far the most powerful ruler in Grim Alice, and was eventually banned in Alice Lapis because it just wouldn't go away. It had to be errated after enough outcry during Alice Cluster, which barely had any effect. Reflect Refrain makes every deck better, took up most tournament results into Lapis Cluster, and is the main contributor to Force of Will as a whole being put in the position it is today. It is both the best ruler in the cluster and one of the worst mistakes Force of Will Co. ever made. Judgment cost of 0, the gimmick of the card is that neither Reflect nor Refrain can battle. Reflect gains magic counters, while Refrain spends them. Reflect's effect also costs 0, and is a modular effect with 3 options. You can only perform this action once per turn, though the errata to this card changes it to once per turn and only during your turn. The first option is Target Resonator gains +200/+200 for turn. Put a magic counter on Reflect. Decent bump for the time, especially for free. The second allows you to draw a card, then put a card from your hand on the bottom of your deck and put a magic counter on Reflect. Finally, recover Target Resonator at the end of your turn, place a magic counter on Reflect. Refrain can return to a J-Ruler for 0 during your opponent's turn and has 3 effects of her own. Rest her and pay 2 magic counters to bounce a Resonator. Rest her and pay X magic counters to cancel target's spell with a total cost of X. Finally, rest her and pay 4 magic counters to tutor any card from your deck to your hand. Reflect Refrain is commonly compared to Magic's own infamous card, Jace the Mind Sculptor. Due to its nature as a ruler, however, I'd argue it's stronger, especially the second effect. Free hand filter where you draw the card first every turn from go. The only way the filter effect could be better is if you discarded the card, in turn setting up grave effects. Jace needs to be drawn and summoned. I'd also argue that Reflect is a lot more versatile than Jace. Reflect can filter your hand, and many turns you will. You likely won't restore a Resonator all that much. Or you will have a combat trick on the fly, which can and will decide many battles in your favour. This isn't even getting into Refrain. Due to how Reflect works, along with their regalia, you're not rushing into Refrain. Reflect is pure value town. You can set up, get all the stones you realistically need into play, set up a wind-secluded refuge to prevent Black Moonbeam from killing her, then you can just alternate between Reflect and Refrain on alternating turns, giving yourself the ability to bounce, cancel, and tutor. This card is so incredibly versatile and gives so much, it's very easy to see, in retrospect, why it was top dog and did the damage it did. Nothing really compares. Even today, I think Reflect would be very powerful. I'd argue it feels more impactful than most rulers today. Reflect was actually banned for a small period of time in Wanderer, Force of Will's legacy format. This was many years ago now, 2017. What ended up being banned permanently is Reflect's Regalia, Change the World Orb of Illusion. A 0-cost Regalia that has 3 effects. Tap for your ruler to gain a magic counter. Tap and remove a magic counter from your J-Ruler, recover your J-Ruler if it has no stats. Pay a wind and tap it, remove 2 magic counters from your J-Ruler, draw a card. I don't play Wanderer, and there isn't much information about it around. But the ban was said to have been done to keep Reflect in format without letting it off the chain. If I was to make a guess as to what the issue actually was, basically everything. It doesn't have Mythic, so you can have multiple out. With Reflect and just 2 of them, you have a draw engine. You can reuse Refrain's abilities, and you can ramp the magic counters. Removing this card does make Reflect less versatile. I think I've really undersold Reflect Refrain in this video, mostly because I find it rather hard to talk about. It doesn't have a theme or one amazing deck under it. Reflect literally goes with everything. It's not an explosive card, but a lot of the time, the strongest cards aren't. Reflect adds consistency, gives free buffs. The Regalia gives exceptionally cheap pluses, and Reflect flips into control. It's pure value town in a meta where most rulers don't do much of anything, and were too scared to even cast Judgment. Of course Reflect had a leg up over everyone. Saying that, after the errata, tournaments did start to diversify a bit. Another set, another two Alice rulers. Though Dark Alice isn't really the same character as regular Alice. She's her dark half given form. We actually haven't seen another real Alice ruler to this day. The closest we got was another Dark Alice in Alice Origins. Dark Alice is something of an interesting reversal on what we've seen so far. We've seen a few themes that were good, but their ruler wasn't. These decks being far more prominent with other rulers. Dark Alice is good, but her shadows don't really appear as a tribal deck. You only see Shadow Faria, a 2-cost lord for shadows that can awaken for 2 darkness and kill a resonator, and even then, it's rare. Girl in the Twilight Garb has one simple effect. For darkness, remove target card from your opponent's graveyard. Remnant was somewhat prominent at this time, as were a couple of graveyard effects. She stops them. Nothing more complicated than that. There is a problem, she answers it. She also stops Resurrection and completely cripples effects like Rezard's March of Undead. It's not amazing functionality, but it does have a significant utility to slow your opponent down. Rather than a judgment cost, Girl in the Twilight Garb has a judgment restriction. You need to have removed 3 cards from your opponent's grave by her other effect. This isn't actually bad if you're getting your opponent to discard cards and killing their board, which you should be, you are playing Darkness. 3 isn't a large amount, and she can essentially gradually pay off her judgment, rather than paying it in one lump sum, making her very different to most any other ruler. As Dark Alice, Maiden of Slaughter, she's a 900/900 Shadow Knight with target attack. She doesn't gain anything by being a shadow, as all shadow support only affects resonators. When she enters, you call a number and destroy all resonators with that cost. While it does have some blowback, it affects both players. It's a great way to thin out your opponent's board, especially if they're going wide. Even if you just get rid of one highly problematic resonator, I think it's worth it. Target attack plays into her murderous theme. 900/900 is enough to kill a decent amount of things. She'll get walled by a fair few commonly played larger resonators, but she can still take care of a lot. Dark Alice's God's Art, Valpurgis Knight, costs 2 Darkness Will, and lowers your opponent's resonators by 200/200. Much like Overlord Valentina, this is a very strange ability and has only been duplicated to my knowledge with Alice Origin 4's Gil Lapis Ruler. It's strange because it creates a floating effect that never goes away and affects all new resonators entering the board. While never used with her to my knowledge, Separation of Body and Spirit becomes a 1-cost kill spell for water with Valpurgis Knight. It also artificially increases all stat reduction effects and damage effects by 200. She's a little slow, but arguably a little bit better for casual games than the later Invading Demon of Water, Valentina, who runs on a similar theme. Valpurgis Knight also searches your deck for Dark Alice's Regalia, Schrödinger the Fallen Black Cat, and places it into play. Schrödinger is one of the first Regalia with an actual cost, being 3. Schrödinger plays into the Girl in Twilight Garb's effect, giving effects depending on how many cards your opponent has removed from the game. While you could use other cards to remove cards from your opponent's grave, the only cards that do so are a Firelight edition called Barrier Seal from Legacy Lost, and Sorrowful Necromancer's Memoria from Battle for Adaractia. Schrödinger doesn't call out Dark Alice specifically, so there might be something there for other decks regarding Barrier Seal, while Sorrowful Necromancer's Memoria is too slow and is a stone that just produces darkness otherwise. It's rather surprising that Schrödinger never got a direct support card, being just left to the Go and Twilight Garb's effect. Nevertheless, at 5 removed, your J-Ruler gains plus 500, and at 10, they gain swiftness and target attack too. While all of this would be nice, even the plus 500 slows her down. Saying that, due to Black Moonbeam, she will need to lay down a wind-secluded refuge to stop it, slowing her down anyway. Schrödinger can also tap to produce will of any attribute, and can be banished to give your J-Ruler imperishable until end of turn. As far as Dark Alice goes, that ramp might be Schrödinger's best use. Dark Alice is a little hard to gauge in my opinion. Some games your opponent will shrug her off till she flips. Other games she'll annoy them endlessly by stopping their plays. Her J-Ruler side is fairly good, but her regalia is highly iffy. She definitely has a place as a meta answer, and I think that should be accounted for. I don't think her doing nothing against some decks is really that much of a knock against her, since 3 will for judgment is fine. It's a bit hard to separate the cost being normal from the idea that the Golden Twilight Garb's effect is doing nothing to hinder your opponent, but we have to. She's an alright ruler. On to the rankings for this set. Fairy Alice is by far the worst ruler of the set. Do Nothing Ruler, quite literally, unimpactful J-Ruler. Better than a lot of SKL, but that's an exceptionally low bar. Sylvia comes up next. On a personal note, I really like her, and am kind of gutted she's not higher up, but it is what it is. She does a lot of cool stuff, and is very far from bad. On the casual table she's great. Head and shoulders above most. But only at the casual table. Dark Alice comes smack dab in the middle. I think she's a fun enough ruler, not in shadows, more good stuff with a darkness focus, but her competitive use puts her a smidge above Sylvia. Runner-up is Overlord Valentina. Much like Machina, she is a fun deck that is rather potent, suiting both the casual player and the competitive player. Finally, and rather obviously, Reflect Refrain is the best ruler of the set. They take your deck and run it better than you ever could. There is little reason to run anything else. Halfway through now, just the Moonlit Saviour and the Battle for Ataraktia to go. This has been Some Gamer Dude, and thanks for watching.